Shapeshifting is an ancient ability that appears in cultures around the world and across a vast period of time. It also appears in an array of types of shapeshifting. Some creatures can simply shift their form due to a natural ability. Gods often change their form, or indeed they change the form of others. Demonic activity, sorcery, and being cursed might also lead to a person shifting their form. Since this is such a vast and multifaceted topic, this episode is going to focus on those creatures able to change their own shape at will. So I'm talking fairies and selkies, things like that. So let's have a look at these shape-shifting creatures in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with Reader Request Month, and this time we're going to be having a look at shapeshifters, and this was a request by John Rabanser, and because shapeshifters are such an absolutely massive topic, which we will get into in just a second, I am actually splitting it across 2 weeks because I realised with everything I was collecting for this week that I actually had enough material for 2 episodes. There's actually way more I could do as well, but there we go. So we're going to have a look at things like fairies and selkies and what have you this week. And then we're going to have a look at people who can shift their form through things like witchcraft. So that's going to be someone having a magical power to do it, or indeed, as I say, witches as well. So that's what we're going to have a look at next week. And then the final week in Reader Request Month is a request I had from Donna, which was for royalty associated with witchcraft, so the likes of Elizabeth Woodville and people like that. I do obviously have other requests that I do need to get into, so I'm hoping to weave those through other episodes throughout this year. And I may indeed do another month as well where it's just requests. So if I haven't done yours yet, then I've either already done it or I'm trying to get to it at some point. But let's get cracking on shapeshifters. Now, like I said in the introduction, it really does appear in quite a lot of different stories. And like I say, obviously the gods are probably the most famous for being able to change their form. Zeus more than most, I think. And obviously they also change the form of others. And there's so many myths involving humans and nymphs being turned into plants or animals through their dealings with the gods. I'm not going to go into examples though, because as I say, I might actually do a separate episode on that if anyone would like. But because it is such a huge topic, I thought I'm going to have to narrow it down somehow. So we are going to be having a look at creatures that can change their own shape at will. And we are obviously going to stick to the British Isles because otherwise this would be like a year's worth of content. And also this is in no way a comprehensive exploration of the topic because it is a podcast episode, not a book. And there have been a couple of times in the past when I've done compilation episodes and people have complained because I haven't included the thing they liked. I can't include everything, so I'm doing my best, basically. But the first thing that we're going to have a look at is shape-shifting supernatural creatures. So this is where creatures shift their form through a change of skin. And this is perhaps an obvious way of shifting your form by basically switching between the two selves that you've got. Like I've said, Selkies are probably one of the most famous examples, particularly in the folklore world around the British Isles. And they're able to change their form between human and seal by discarding or returning to their seal skin. Now, I do have a full podcast episode about Selkies, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here because, as I say, you can go and listen to the Selkies episode, which I will link below. But they do demonstrate the way in which a supernatural creature can shift forms in a really consistent way. And unlike some of the fairies and ghosts that we're about to meet who can change their form at will, these skin-based shapeshifters move between 2 forms. They're quite concrete forms at that as well. It isn't always entirely clear what benefit they get from their human form, and it depends on the stories. And I think when you look at the male Selkies by comparison, they really love the ladies, so I think it's fairly obvious what they get out of being human, but it's less obvious what the female Selkies get out of being human. But it is also quite a fascinating motif, and while I said we were going to stick to the British Isles, I do just want to note that you do get examples of this same principle all over the world. And one of the most famous examples is the Swan Maidens, which you get in folklore in different places, and these are essentially the same as Selkies, but instead of discarding a seal skin, it's sort of a swan skin instead. You also have other variations where they might turn into cassowaries and other types of bird as well. And in these stories, the focus is most often on shape-shifting women, and they're usually presented as docile or compliant, and human men will steal their skins and then force them into marriages, although if the maiden does actually regain her skin, she's just going to return to her natural environment. And in quite a lot of the stories, these women are portrayed as somehow being bad mothers because they tend to abandon any children that they've had with the husband. And you think, yes, but if the husband hadn't kind of kidnapped them and kept them against their will, that wouldn't have happened. So I think it says a lot about gender dynamics in different areas and different places and so on. But the shift to the human form is generally only temporary, and the preferred form is the animal form. And meanwhile, the Kelpie of Scottish legend, which again I do have an episode on, so I'm not going to go into too much, is a shapeshifter in some tales between humans and horses. So while some stories just see them as horses, in others they can actually shift their form. And in these accounts, the Kelpie is often a human with hooves. Now, Kelpies as a whole are sometimes considered fairies, while others like Catherine Briggs actually consider them to be nature spirits. But when Kelpies appear in male form, they're said to be very hairy, and they jump out at lone travellers on deserted roads to crush people to death. And most depictions actually show the female Kelpies as being really seductive and hypersexual. So they take the form of beautiful women and then lure men to their deaths in the water. So in both cases, the human form for the Kelpie acts as a way to access their victims, though it doesn't really appear to be their true form. Shapeshifting in this regard does serve them a purpose. Now, I did mention that some people think that Kelpies are fairies, and it's worth obviously getting into fairies because this is quite a large topic. And I have sort of stuck to the northeast of England with these ones. A, because obviously it's where I'm from and what I know. But B, we've just got some really interesting shape-shifting creatures up here, so I thought I'm going to include these. Now, some fairies are believed to be able to turn into different animals. Now, John Cruise actually suggests this might be less to do with any inherent ability to do so, and more to do with the fluidity of the boundaries between fairies and animals. And indeed, some people do consider fairies to be nature spirits as well. Cruise also suggests that the ability to change form is comparatively rare among British fairies, where they favour glamour to change their appearance instead. That said, there are some branches of the fairy family that make shape-shifting a central part of what they do. And these are the so-called bogey beasts, and they are really, really common in a lot of the stories, as I say, in Northumberland, and also further south down into the likes of County Durham and so on as well. Now, bogey beasts tend to use shape-shifting as a way to fool humans, they wreak havoc, and they cause harm with merry abandon. And many of them don't really speak, but they've got some sort of trademark so that people know that they've encountered them. That might be a favoured haunt, it might be a sound, or it might be a feature like flaming eyes. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the Headley Cow, and cow is actually spelled K-O-W, and it's named after the place of Headley. And the Headley Cow is described as a bogey by William Henderson, and he's an unusual shapeshifter because he also takes the form of inanimate objects, which is something that we see a little bit less often among the other bogey beasts. And in one famous tale, he actually turns himself into a bale of straw near an old woman gathering sticks. Pleased at such a find, the woman would then try and carry the straw home, but the bale would become progressively heavier and heavier until she put it back down. At this point, the bundle would stand up and shuffle away, vanishing with a snickering horse-like laugh, and at this point the woman would know that she'd encountered the Headley Cow. Now, interestingly, the Headley Cow could actually appear as two figures, not just one. And according to local legend in 1880, two young men in Headley set off to meet their girlfriends, and they'd agreed to meet them on the way to Prudder. But the men were half a mile from the agreed meeting place when they could see that the girls were already waiting for them. So the pair sped up, but as they did so, the girls then started walking away instead of waiting for them. They also ignored the men's calls, so the men broke into a faster pace. And every time the men sped up, the girls also hurried up until both pairs were almost running. Inexplicably, the girls then veered off the path and headed off across a field. The boys hurried after them, but within minutes they found themselves in a bog, their legs soaked up to their knees. The girls finally moved towards them, morphing into a single beast, largely believed to be horse-shaped, as it reached them. The Headley Cow, as they realised it was, gave its trademark laugh and disappeared. Thankfully, the story does point out that the men did actually get themselves out of the bog after all. And we could also look at the Brag, which is a shape-shifting creature found in the hobgoblin family. The Picktree Brag could apparently change its form, being a calf, a headless naked man, and, and I quote, 4 men holding a white sheet, end quote. It does beg the question how anyone knew each of these different entities was the same Brag, but there we go. And as with the Headley Cow, shapeshifting allowed the brag to persecute individuals and carry out its mischief. Now, there seems to be little reason for it to target anyone other than the fact it found it funny, and much like the tricksters we find elsewhere in folklore, the shapeshifter in this category likes to disrupt order and play pranks purely because it can. But I did want to include one final little example of shapeshifting fairies, because I absolutely love this one. And it's basically the idea of fairies taking the form of cats, but then living with humans. And there was an incident recorded at Beggar Bush Farm near Easington in County Durham. So the farmer, John Bonner, was heading home one night when something leapt out of the hedge into the back of his cart. It cried, "Johnny Bonner, Johnny, when thou gets yem, tell your cat Catherine Curley's deed." Yem in this case is home and deed is dead, but you probably figured that bit out. Now John turned round to see who was speaking to him and found a big cat in the back of his cart. It leapt back into the hedge and then John drove home in a bit of a panic. When he got home, his wife asked why he was so terrified, so he told her what had happened, repeating the big cat's words. As soon as the words left his mouth, their pet cat jumped up and cried, "Ah, Munawa," and ran out of the door, as in, "I'm away." They never saw her again. A similar story actually happened in Staindrop, and people generally assumed that the cats were fairies in feline form, and they were rushing to leave so they could attend a family funeral. Sadly, the stories don't explain why the fairies were in feline form and living with farmers, but this does suggest that for these fairies, being able to adopt another form indefinitely was well within their remit. Were it not for the death announcement, you have to wonder how long they would have stayed on the farm. And I thought this was a good place to move on to ghosts, because the first one we're going to have a look at is one of those strange creatures that could be a ghost or it could be a bogey beast, depending on which source you're looking at. And I am actually putting down ghosts as shapeshifters, because there are some tales of beings described as ghosts that shift their form. So the Barghest, that friend of Fabulous Folklore, would be an excellent example. Now, a Barghest apparently haunted the area near Darlington at one point, and it shifted forms between a black dog, a white cat or rabbit, a headless woman and a headless man who disappeared in a flash of flame. Like the Pictree Brag, it's unclear how people knew these forms were the same Barghest. Now, like I said, Barghests already straddle that line of, are they black dogs and are they bogey beasts? Because black dogs are more spectral in nature, and often they're described as ghosts that have taken the form of a black dog, which in and of itself is a form of shapeshifting. But then some of the Barghest stories do see them playing tricks on people, and indeed in some places they are described as bogey beasts or members of the goblin family. So that would then obviously suggest that perhaps they have a natural shape-shifting ability anyway. Now I will obviously link to my Barghest episode in case you haven't listened to that in the show notes, rather than go into too much detail here. But either way, the result is the same. A spectral black dog is still a ghost that has changed form, and a bogey beast is a shapeshifter by its very nature. And indeed the Northumbrian Dunny is often believed to be a Border Reaver ghost on Belford Moor. According to legend, he hid his treasure in a cave, but then he died before he could tell anyone where it was. And this, surprisingly, was once a key reason for ghosts continuing to haunt. Once someone found their hidden treasure, they could then stop haunting. And we did actually see this in the tale of Megha Meldon in the episode that I did sometime last year, who seemed to roam her local area in Northumberland until her hidden money caches were found. But the Dunny appears no mere ghost, which explains why I've included him here, because the Dunny could also shift forms, appearing in stories as a horse or a donkey, and he's often described as a dun-coloured pony, which perhaps explains his name. A favourite trick involved him appearing as the farmer's horse when the farmer needed to fetch the midwife. So then he would carry the midwife and the farmer to the mother-to-be, but then when the farmer took the midwife home, the Dunny would disappear at the moment he carried them over a stream, depositing them in the water. Now, given other supernatural creatures also enjoyed this kind of trick, including the Headley Cow, there was a tendency to try and keep pregnant women away from unknown horses in the area, although there are plenty of stories about the Headley Cow of them actually appearing in the form of a farmer's favourite horse, so it would be difficult to really differentiate between unknown horses and your own if the Headley Cow could take the form of either of them. So what exactly do we make of these shapeshifters? Well, changing their form is intrinsic to who and what they are. So whether they're Selkies discarding their skin to appear human, or bogey beasts seeking to wreak havoc, shifting their form is a simple thing for them to do. As Cruz notes, it points out the fluidity of the boundary between humanoid and other for some of the fairies, and as nature spirits, changing their form into an animal, bird or insect would make a lot of sense for them. Now, the bogey beasts are slightly different because their shifting depends on the prank that they want to play. So for the Headley Cow, appearing as a horse to the two men meeting their girlfriends would have made little sense, and the men would likely have ignored it. But appearing as the girlfriends they were on their way to meet, clearly the men are going to follow them, making it easier to lure them into the bog. Now, it is unclear if the bogey beasts play their pranks with a genuine wish to harm humans, or if they just like causing chaos. But being able to appear as one thing and then another makes playing pranks a lot easier. And shapeshifting obviously also appears in popular culture, so if we look at someone like Mystique in the X-Men, she may not be able to change form into a different species, instead transforming into different people, but her shapeshifting ability ultimately aligns her with the bogey beasts out to cause mischief by fooling others. But the one thing I would say is perhaps speak kindly to your cat this evening, because who knows if it's really just a cat. And I think if anyone is familiar with cats, you wouldn't be a bit surprised to find out that it might be a fairy in disguise. But anyway, so that is the end of our discussion of shapeshifters in terms of fairies and ghosts. And like I say, I did have to narrow it down somehow, so I just thought I'd pick the northeast ones because they're the ones that I know the best. There are other versions in other parts of the country, and indeed obviously places like Scotland and Wales and so on as well. But I thought I'll try and narrow it down somehow, because otherwise we'd be literally here all year. Like I said at the beginning, next week we'll have a look at those shapeshifters who can change shape through magic. So the best example of this, and obviously it's not from folklore, it's from film, but still, is the battle between Merlin and Madame Mim in The Sword and the Stone from 1963, the Disney film, where they've got this duel where they're changing form and so on. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to have a look at next week. And as I say, we'll finish off the reader request month with royalty associated with witchcraft. And I do also have themes for February and March as well. So if you do have any other requests, please feel free to still pop them in the link below. There's a form linked in the show notes, and obviously I'll get to it at some point. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. I hope you're enjoying January so far, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.